Hi, good morning and good evening to our dear friends across the globe. Welcome to the webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Management of Development Safety Update Reports, Unravelling the Enigma. The safety summary of investigational medicine products during their development or clinical trial phase is elaborated in internationally harmonized document DSUR. Needless to say, a comprehensive and detailed safety analysis of various clinical trials, observationals, or epidemiological studies, non-clinical studies to name a few, is a prerequisite to prepare this exhaustive document. The professionals at AWINSA, with an eye for detail, accomplish this seamlessly. Before we start the webinar, I would like to draw your attention to some of our housekeeping rules. Today's webinar is presented by AWINSA Life Sciences, a global provider of pharmacovigilance, clinical safety, medical information, and medical writing services. Manned by people with discernment and an eye for quality, we at AWINSA ensure astute analysis of safety reports so that clinical scenarios emerge in perspicuity. Before I introduce our three speakers, I would like to cover a few housekeeping topics. You are welcome to post your questions during the webinar. We would do our level best to address your questions. In case we are not able to answer due to time constraints, we will try to respond to you via email. Webinar will be available for download on demand after a couple of days. Today's presenters are Dr. Sanjeev Miglani, Dr. Mugdha Chopra, and myself, Shruti Mehrotra. I will now introduce the speakers to you. Dr. Sanjeev is the founder and director of AWINSA Life Sciences. He is MD in internal medicine and has over 20 years of experience in the field of medicine, pharmacovigilance, and clinical research. In his last assignment, he was the Vice President of Safety, Medical Affairs at APSUR. Just before joining APSUR, Sanjeev was the Vice President for Pharmacovigilance and Medical Writing at Accenture, and had been in senior leadership roles in some other companies like CIDP, CliniRx, and Ranbaxy. He has also worked as a senior resident in cardiology and medicine department. Dr. Mugdha, she is the co-founder and director of AWINSA Life Sciences and has 16 plus years of experience in pharmacovigilance and clinical research industry. She was Associate Vice President for USPV and Clinical Safety at APSUR in her last role and was overseeing the delivery and PV operations, including but not limited to case processing, aggregate reporting, literature monitoring, and signal detection. Before joining APSUR, she was with Ranbaxy as compliance lead. She comes with an extensive experience in various safety databases like Argus Safety, RSG, and has also met the challenge of business continuity planning and data restoration under situations of database failure. At this moment, I would like to hand over the floor to Mugdha to begin the presentation today.
Thanks, Shruti, for the nice introduction. In the webinar today, we will be talking about the Development Safety Update Report, which is the aggregate report for the products under investigation. I'll talk about the objectives of the DSUR, the scope of the DSUR, general principles which have to be followed while preparing and submitting the DSUR. Dr. Sanjeev Miglani will talk about the content of the DSUR and the sectional presentation of the DSUR. And Shruti Mehrotra will walk us through the appendices and the regional appendices of the DSUR as per ICH E2F. From safety perspective, comprehensive and critical analysis of the evolving information on the risks and evidence of benefits must be identified and reported. And all of this is clearly reflected in the aggregate reports, which are required to be prepared as a part of the pharmacovigilance requirements. Aggregate reports are the reports which emphasize on evaluation of the safety profile and benefit risk evaluation of the product and do not just focus on the individual cases as such. Aggregate reporting, so as to say, is the process which reviews the cumulative safety information from a wide range of sources on a periodic basis and submit the findings to the regulatory authorities worldwide. So aggregate reports are required both during the pre-marketing and the post-marketing stages of a product. With regard to the aggregate reporting in clinical trials, if we look from the historical perspective, IND annual report was considered as the aggregate report to be submitted by the sponsor in the US. Similarly, Europe has EU annual safety report. As a part of the harmonization, US and European regulators consider that DSUR can be submitted by the sponsor who is conducting the clinical trials globally, which would also meet the national and the regional requirements. Like any other aggregate report, there are many stakeholders in the preparation of the DSUR. All these stakeholders help in providing data to the medical writers for preparation of the DSUR so that it is submitted, prepared, reviewed within the timelines. Just to take an example, data is required for worldwide marketing authorization to be included in the DSUR, which is provided by the sponsor's regulatory affairs department. Clinical operations team similarly is required to share the data regarding the status of the clinical trials, how many trials are ongoing, how many trials are completed, along with the subject exposure to the investigational medicinal product in the development program. Safety data as such is required to be presented in the DSUR. For example, the 9 listings or the summary tabulations, they come from the safety team who's managing the safety of the study. Thus, it is very important for different departments of the sponsor team to have a kickoff meeting before initiating the preparation of the DSUR so that the DSUR can be prepared in a seamless manner and submitted within the reporting timelines as per the regulatory requirements. The main objective of the DSUR is to present a comprehensive annual review and evaluation of pertinent safety information collected during the reporting period related to a drug under investigation, whether or not it is marketed, by examining whether the information obtained by the sponsor during the reporting period is in accordance with the previous knowledge of the investigational drug safety. So overall, intent is to, or emphasis is on the cumulative data review and not just on the review of the data from the reporting period itself. Other objectives are to describe the new safety issues that could have an impact on the protection of the clinical trial subjects and to provide an update on the status of the clinical development program to the regulatory authorities. And one of the most important objective is to summarize the current understanding and management of identified and potential risks. So identified risk is basically an untoward occurrence for which there is an adequate evidence of an association with the investigational medicine product. For example, any adverse reaction, which is adequately demonstrated in non-clinical studies and confirmed by the clinical data as well, or any adverse reaction observed in the clinical trials, which is suggesting a causal relationship. Such adverse reactions are basically identified risks. So potential risk is basically any untoward occurrence for which there is some basis for suspicion of a causal relationship with the investigational product, but causal association as such has not been confirmed, like non-clinical safety concerns that are not confirmed in the human clinical trials. So these all are basically the potential risks. A DSUR should thus be very concise and should provide information to assure the regulatory authorities that sponsors are adequately monitoring and evaluating the evolving safety profile of the investigational products. The main focus of the DSUR is data and findings from interventional clinical trials of drugs that are under investigation, whether or not they have the marketing approval. Because clinical development of a drug is frequently continued following marketing approval as well. So relevant information from post-marketing studies should also be included in the DSUR. And the DSUR should concentrate primarily on the investigational drug, providing information on comparators as well only when it is relevant to the safety of the trial subjects. The DSUR should provide safety information from all the ongoing clinical trials and other studies that the sponsor is conducting or has completed during the reporting period, which includes the clinical trials using an investigational drug like the phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 trials, and the clinical trials conducted using marketed drugs and approved indications like phase 4 trials. So there are therapeutic use of an investigational drug like the expanded access programs or compassionate use programs, and clinical trials conducted to support changes in the manufacturing process of medicinal products. So the DSUR should also include significant other findings pertinent to the safety of the investigational drug, including findings from any observational or any epidemiological studies, or findings from non-clinical studies like toxicological studies or in vitro studies, or even the studies which are recently published in the literature. Periodic safety update report is the aggregate report in a similar manner, but it is required for post-marketing phase of the product. What is the relationship exactly between the DSUR and the periodic safety update report? At present, some ICH countries and regions accept submission of periodic safety update report to fulfill their requirements for periodic reporting for the approved products. Although the focus of DSUR is on the investigational drugs, there can be overlap between the content of the DSUR and the PSUR. For example, information from the marketing experience, which is reported in the PSUR, that might be relevant to the clinical development and has to be reported in the DSUR as well. Any safety finding from clinical trials conducted using marketed drugs would also be included in the DSUR, but would be pertinent to actually post-marketing safety as well and should be reported in the PSUR also. So in nutshell, both DSUR and PSUR should be comprehensive and standalone as they focus on different subject matters, they have different periodicities, they have different recipients, but the data can be overlapping if the product is also marketed. Where all DSUR is required to be submitted. The DSUR is intended to serve as an annual report to the regulatory authorities. So as I mentioned in the beginning, a harmonized report is now being submitted to the ICH regions largely. Still, there are some nuances specifically for certain regions where some specific format might be required for the aggregate report for the clinical trials. I would also like to clarify here regarding the submission of the DSUR to ethics committees or institutional review boards. Generally, ethics committees or IRBs require just the executive summary of the DSUR to be submitted to them, unless they have any specific requirements as per their standard operating procedures or their processes. This executive summary is supplemented with the line listing of the serious adverse reactions. There are some general principles which have to be followed for preparation of the DSUR. In order to promote a comprehensive analysis and presentation of the safety profile of the investigational drug, sponsor should prepare a single DSUR with all the data pertinent to all dosage forms and strengths, all indications, and all the patient populations under study with the investigational drug. If more than one sponsor is involved in the drug development, like if there is a co-development program or if there is a business agreement between the two partners, then a single DSUR can be submitted. Talking about the periodicity at which a DSUR should be submitted, so the Development International Birth Date, or as we say DIBD, is used to determine the start of the annual report of the or annual period of the DSUR. This date is the sponsor's first authorization to conduct a clinical trial in any country worldwide. The start of the annual period of the DSUR is the month and the date of the DIBD. When the sponsor's first clinical trial is conducted in a country without a formal authorization process, sponsor should designate an appropriate date linked to the commencement of the first clinical trial. And where clinical trials are ongoing in one country and later initiated in any other country, the original DIBD should always be maintained and used for all the countries in preparing the DSUR. So that particular DIBD should be considered as the data log point for preparation of the DSUR across all the countries worldwide. The data log point of the DSUR should be the last day of the 1-year reporting period. Also, when clinical development of a drug continues following a marketing approval in any country worldwide, Both a PSUR and DSUR should be submitted as specified by the national laws. As we were discussing, the data will be overlapping, but obviously a PSUR also has to be submitted and a separate DSUR also has to be submitted as per the requirements. And if sponsor wants a DSUR, can be prepared based on the PSUR international birth date as well, so that DSUR and PSURs can be synchronized. And in synchronization, the data log points of the DSUR and PSUR, the period covered by the next DSUR should be no longer than 1 year. And the DSUR should be submitted to all the concerned regulatory authorities, but no later than 60 calendar days after the DSUR data log point. So as we were discussing earlier, and as I mentioned earlier, as DSUR has to be submitted to the concerned regulatory authorities within 60 days of the data log point, it is very imperative that a kickoff meeting is conducted and data is provided to the medical writers within a week or 10 days, so that the DSUR can be effectively drafted, efficiently reviewed, and submitted to the regulatory authorities within the defined timelines. DSUR should continue to be submitted for as long as indicated by the national or regional laws or regulations. It all depends on individual country requirements. For example, in the US, sponsors might keep an IND open even if no clinical trials are ongoing or planned, and annual reports are submitted for as long as the IND remains open. When submission of an annual report is no longer required in any country, it should always be indicated that the final DSUR serves as the last annual report for that investigational drug in that country, and regulatory authorities should not expect any other DSUR which will be reported to them after the last DSUR. There are certain responsibilities of different stakeholders regarding the DSUR. The sponsor of a clinical trial is responsible for preparation and submission of a DSUR. The sponsor can though delegate the responsibility of the DSUR to a third party like a CRO who can prepare and submit the DSUR on behalf of the sponsor. In situations where sponsor does not have access to the information to be included in specific sections of the DSUR. For example, sponsor investigators. These are the individuals who both initiate and conduct a clinical trial alone or with the others, and under their direction, the investigational product is administered to a subject. Such sponsor investigators might not have the information on certain sections of the DSUR, like the manufacturing issues or the non-clinical data or the marketing status. If they do not have this information, it should be clearly mentioned in the DSUR which is submitted for that IMP to the regulatory authorities. So when there are more than one sponsor of a clinical trial, it can happen that parties, there is a co-development program, or there are business partners. So these parties should arrange to prepare a single DSUR if possible. So there can be situation when there is a licensing relationship with one or more partners, or where individual clinical trials involve a collaboration with business partners. So in this situation, a single DSUR is always recommended by the guidelines. Nevertheless, the written agreements should be in place specifying how data will be exchanged between the parties, how the responsibilities are detailed in the agreement for the preparation and submission of the DSUR. When a single DSUR cannot be arranged, multiple sponsors, can agree to prepare separate DSURs for the same investigational drug. This can occur when different indications or route of administration or formulations are being investigated by different parties. In this situation, rationale for separate DSUR should be provided in each report. The sponsors should select the most appropriate options based on the judgment for combination therapy, specifically taking into account the patient population, indication, formulation, as well as the circumstances in which the clinical trials are being conducted. And in general, a single DSUR should be prepared for the clinical trials involving a fixed dose combination product, that is, a product consisting of at least 2 active ingredients in a fixed dose that is administered in a single dosage form. If the sponsor is also conducting clinical trials with individual components of the fixed combination product, separate DSUR should be submitted for each component. And relevant findings from each DSUR should be summarized in the section 8.5, which is new safety data related to the combination therapy of the other DSUR. So Dr. Sanjeev will be talking about these sections in detail in his presentation, and he'll detail about the requirements of these particular sections. Again, for combination therapies, for trials which are having multi-drug therapy or the combination therapy, that is combination of drugs that are not fixed, the sponsors can prepare either a DSUR for multi-drug therapy or a DSUR for one or more individual components. In this case, the information on the multi-drug therapy trials can be included in the DSUR of one or all the components. This is the depiction or the representation of the strategies for preparation of the DSURs for multi-drug therapies. If you see here, in case there is an investigational drug A and marketed drug X, Y, or Z, so either a single DSUR focusing on all the products like A, X, Y, and Z can be prepared, or guideline also says that a single DSUR focusing on just investigational drug can be prepared, but it should include the data on the multi-drug therapy as well. Similarly, if there are two separate investigational drugs A and B, so either a single DSUR can be prepared focusing on the combination A plus B, or there can be two separate DSURs, A for A and separate DSUR for B, but each including data for the multi-drug therapy. So these are different scenarios which guidances sometimes try to explain so that sponsors can take a call based on what kind of drug development program they are running for what kind of investigational drugs. So reference safety information is a very important aspect of the DSUR. The investigator's brochure, in effect, at the start of the reporting period, should serve as the reference safety information to determine whether the information received during the reporting period remains consistent with previous knowledge of the safety profile of the investigational drug. There is a specific section, which is section 7.1 of the DSUR, which should clearly indicate the version number and the date of the IB used for this particular purpose. When an IB is not required by national laws or regulations, the applicable regional product label, like it is from US perspective, it is US product information, or from European perspective, it is summary of product characteristics. So they should serve as the reference safety information. Usually a single document is serving as a reference safety information. However, there are circumstances that it might be appropriate to use more than one reference document to support the DSUR. For example, for a DSUR providing information on an investigational drug used in combination and as well as a monotherapy. If the IB has been revised during the reporting period and not previously submitted to the relevant regulatory authority, the sponsor should provide a copy of the current version of the IB as an attachment to the DSUR. Now, from RSI perspective, I would like to emphasize on a very important point here that there is a guideline which was published by the Clinical Trial Facilitation Group in Europe, according to which serious adverse reactions which are more than or equal to 2 in number should be included as a part of the reference safety information in the IB. Serious adverse reactions which are occurring just once should only be included if there is a strong causal relationship between the serious adverse reaction and the investigational drug. So this is basically the recommended format and content of the DSUR, including the table of contents, the section numbering, and the content of each section. So for each heading, there are basically 20 different headings to be included in the DSUR. And then obviously there are appendices to the DSUR, and there are regional appendices to the DSUR, which Shruti will be talking about. So for each heading where information is available, the information should be presented concisely. But where information is not available or a DSUR section is not applicable, this should also be clearly stated in the DSUR that this information is either not available or it is not applicable for this particular product. So DSUR has a title page basically at the beginning. So the title page of the DSUR should have the DSUR number, and the reports should be numbered sequentially, DSUR number 1, 2, 3, and so on. And the investigational drug details, the reporting period, the date of the report, the sponsor's name and complete address, and obviously a statement on the confidentiality of the information included in the DSUR, as the other aggregate reports also have. And there should also be a cautionary statement that the DSUR includes the unblinded information if applicable, and this holds true both for the regulatory and ethics committee submission. Now, for the executive summary, as I was mentioning earlier, that it basically some of the ethics committees basically just need the executive summary submission to them unless they have any specific procedures or processes in place. So executive summary serves as the standalone document suitable for submission to the ethics committee and other stakeholders along with the title page. So it is a concise summary of the important information contained in the report. And the information in the executive summary includes some basic introduction about the report number and the reporting period, the investigational drug, about the mode of action, the therapeutic class, indication, estimated cumulative exposure, about the marketing approval, and summary of the overall safety concerns or the overall risks, which are basically detailed in the section 18 and section 19 of the DSUR. So in a way to say, the summary of the complete information which is there in the body of the DSUR should be summarized clearly and concisely in the executive summary so that it becomes a standalone document for submission to the ethics committee. So I think this is all what I have for today. I would now like to hand over to Dr. Sanjeev, who will present the sections of the DSUR in detail. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Mugdha, for this nice session. And I'll now talk about the different sections of the DSUR. Well, as Mugdha mentioned that whenever we are working on any DSUR, it's very important that we should have ideally a kind of a kickoff meeting. And practically in that kickoff meeting, the stakeholders should be kind of having a clear role and responsibility metrics, wherein they should know what exactly they need to provide. So there are different sections, and I'll talk about different sections in my slides. And the main thing is that there are different stakeholders like the regulatory team who would provide the data on the worldwide marketing authorization status, or the clinical operations team would need to give data for the study exposure, like number of patients who were exposed during the clinical studies. Similarly, the clinical data management team would need to give data from the clinical database. So it's very important that all the stakeholders understand the roles and responsibilities what they have, because even though the medical writing team of the safety division or the PV team is responsible for preparing the report, it's very important that they get the data within some defined time frame after the data log point, so that the report is prepared well in time. And ideally, the request should be made to the stakeholders well before the data log point, so that the stakeholders can start working on the reports. Well, the most important section is the introduction, and in this particular section, it is very important to briefly mention about things like DIBD. So this international birth date is basically the date when any clinical trial for any investigational product gets approved for the first time in the human population. Then it's important to mention the reporting period. We should be having the background knowledge of the previous report so that we can correlate the previous data, and then we need to mention the sequential number correctly. We need to mention about the investigational drug. Sometimes there could be different dosage formulations or different route of administration. So it's very important to emphasize in the introduction that we're dealing with which all routes of administration, how many dosage that we are dealing with, what's the different formulation that we have for the investigational drug, and what are the different indications which are being evaluated in the clinical trial in parallel for that reporting period. It's very important that we should provide a short summary of the scope of clinical trials covered by the report. We need to give a brief description and explanation of any information that has not been included in the DSUR. Sometimes the safety exchange there is a safety exchange agreement between different partners, and the partners are supposed to provide some information. So just in case there is any kind of a limitation in providing the data by any of the partner, so the rationale should be clearly mentioned if in case some data is not provided. And of course, there could be some scenarios where there are some multiple DSURs which are prepared by the sponsor for different dosage formulation. Ideally, a single DSUR suffices the purpose, and there is no requirement for preparing different DSURs. But sometimes if the sponsor has any particular rationale, so different DSURs can be provided, but then the explanation should be given for doing so. Then the second section is worldwide marketing authorization status. Now, of course, this is applicable if the product is also approved. If the product is just in the investigational phase, which happens most of the time, so then anyway, this section will not be applicable. But there could be some scenarios where the product may be also approved at the same time while it is also being investigated in different clinical trials. And this generally happens in many oncology trials or sometime in the infectious disease also, wherein the drug may be approved already for a particular indication, but then it might still be in the investigational phase for different other indications. So if the product is approved or being marketed, so we have to provide the data for the date of approval, indications, the approved dosages, and wherever it is approved. So we have to mention that. And something similar to the PSUR, like where there is a kind of a specific format for providing this data. Again, a very important section here is actions which are taken in the reporting period. And this is again applicable for both clinical trials as well as the marketing in case the product is also already marketed. And basically the idea of this particular section is to provide any kind of actions which are taken from safety perspective. So of course, there can be different actions which could be taken maybe for commercial reasons, but that is not applicable here. The idea here is to just kind of mention those kind of activities or actions which have been taken in the reporting period from safety perspective. And it could be any action taken by the sponsor, it could be any action taken by the data monitoring committees or SS committees or the regulatory authority, which can have an impact on the conduct of the clinical trials from the safety perspective. And if there is any kind of change in the IB, that can be anyway dealt in a different section, which is changes to RSI. And some of the examples could be like there is a kind of a refusal to authorize a clinical trial for some safety reason, or sometimes there could be a recall of the investigational drug or comparator. There could be some risk management activities that can be implemented during the course of the trial. Sometimes like there could be some protocol modifications. Just to take an example, say if a particular drug is causing vomiting and say as a sponsor, a decision is taken to give some prophylactic antiemetic so that the patients do not have vomiting because this was a safety concern that was identified during the course of the trial. So any kind of a risk management activity which could include any protocol modification, or say if there is a particular restriction which is imposed on a study population during the course of the trial, or if there is a kind of a change to the informed consent, so again due to safety issue. So all of these things which are a part of the risk management activities, so they are required to be mentioned if they are implemented during the course of the trial. And of course, this is not just confined to the clinical trials. If there is any particular action taken with regard to the marketed products, say if there is a failure to obtain a marketing approval renewal, or if there is a withdrawal of a suspension of a marketing approval, again, any kind of a risk management activities for any particular such product which is in the marketing. So again, that is also required to be mentioned in this particular section. It's very important that this section should also summarize a request from the regulatory authorities that places a specific limitation on the current or the future development. So if there is a, just to take an example, there could be say a request by the regulatory authority, say FDA, to conduct a long-term animal studies, or could be a long-term study which could be in the human population also, just to see if there is a kind of a element of some new safety concern, which could be say hepatotoxicity or carcinogenicity. So if there is a kind of a particular request laid down by any regulatory authority, and we have to basically ensure that those things are mentioned, and of course they have to be implemented also. And if any such request is there, it's very important that a cumulative listing of such requests should be provided in this particular report, in this section. Then the next section is the changes to the RSI. And RSI, of course, is primarily containing the safety adverse events. Now, if you look from the EU perspective, especially the CTFG guidance document, when it comes to the serious adverse events, in the RSI section, as per the CTFG guidance document that came a couple of years back, they have clearly mentioned that we should particularly emphasize on the serious adverse reactions. And in fact, only those serious adverse reactions should be mentioned which have occurred more than once in the human population. Of course, there can be some exceptions when there is a single serious adverse reaction which can still be captured in the RSI tabulation, but that is only kind of a kind of an exception, because these kind of things should be captured in the RSI only if there is a strong causal association, if we have a strong evidence of positive rechallenge or positive rechallenge, and we think that even a single SAR can warrant the kind of update in the RSI. So in only those circumstances, the RSI should have any SAR whose frequency is just for which the frequency is just 1. Otherwise, only if the SAR is having frequency more than 1, those kind of events should be a part of the RSI. But of course, from the global perspective, when we talk about RSI, RSI is containing, of course, other safety sections like exclusion criteria, contraindications, warnings, precautions. So if there is any kind of a change in the RSI, whether it's in the SAR count or if there is any change in the contraindication, warning, precautions, or any kind of adverse events of special interest, so it's very important that any changes to RSI for these kind of things should be mentioned in the report in the section 4. Then there is a section on inventory of clinical trials, and this particular section is specific to the reporting period, and we have to provide the data both for the ongoing as well as the completed clinical trials. And this data should be provided in the form of some tabulations. And of course, my colleague Shruti will talk about different appendices in the end, wherein she will highlight how this data should be provided. The most important part here is that the tables, whether they are for ongoing or completed, they should include information for all of these clinical trials, and they should have the data like the subject study ID, the phase, whether it's 1, 2, or 1, 2, 3, or 4, the status of the trial, whether it's ongoing or completed, the countries where the trial is conducted, then the design of the study, whether it's a open label or double blind or crossover study, what's the dose and regimen of the investigational drug for that clinical trial, the study population, including age, gender, indication, what's the date of the clinical trial start. So basically the table which is going to be applicable for the ongoing and the clinical completed trials should have all of these parameters as a part of the requirement of the ICH E2F. Then there is a section on the estimated cumulative exposure, and basically this cumulative exposure is both for the clinical trials as well as marketing. Of course, when the product is approved, only in those scenarios that section will be applicable. Otherwise, we just have to provide the subject exposure data only for the development programs or basically the clinical trials. And the most important thing is that again here all the data has to be provided in the tabular format. It's very important that we need to provide the data in forms of informed number of patients who are exposed. I mean, like I'll talk about the marketing scenario also if the product is marketed, how this data has to be provided. But in terms of the data for the clinical trials, it's important that we get the data from the individual clinical operation manager who are dealing with the clinical study, or maybe the clinical data management team can provide this data. Of course, this data is dynamic because the patients keep on getting randomized at a fast pace. So sometimes it's very difficult to get the exact data. But of course, here there's a big role of the teamwork, and the clinical operation manager or the clinical data managers should be able to provide this data. And if we look into the specific section of the data for the development program, it's important that we provide the data in terms of the subjects exposed to drug, subjects exposed to comparator, or maybe on placebo, or if there's a blinded therapy. Now here it's very important to understand that it's not that for the purpose of DSUR, the data needs to be unblinded. So whatever data is there in that form, like say if there's a blinded study, and if we don't know whether the patient is on actual drug or comparator or placebo, so obviously the entire study population we have to count under blinded therapy. So just for the purpose of creating DSUR, obviously there is no requirement of unblinding. The study design and the structure always remains the same. It's just that if we have the data, say for an open label study where we know how many patients are exposed to drug and how many patients were exposed to comparator. So based on the data that is available, we just have to provide in a table that you can see in this format. Again, the representation should be very clear, and the representation should also be given in the form of data or the patients in terms of age, sex, racial group. So that's very important. And again, anyway, since this data is captured in the CRF, so this data can be derived from the database, clinical database, I mean, and the clinical data managers play a very important role in providing such kind of data. Now, when it comes to the post-marketing, something similar to PSUR has to be done. So, say, let me take an example. If there is a chronic disease, say there is a particular drug for hypertension or diabetes, and this is basically being given on a daily basis. So obviously, if we just have the numerator in terms of number of drugs which are sold, and say if we divide by 365, so we get the patient treatment years, or practically the number of patients who were exposed to the drug. Similarly, if you are dealing with a particular antibiotic for a infectious disease, so we can kind of define on an average how many tablets the patient is taking as a part of the course or the therapy for that particular infection. And then if we divide that by the total, if we take the total number of tablets as a numerator, then we can actually define how many courses were taken, and that would practically give the number of patients. So if we have the data for any kind of drug which is also in the marketing phase, so we have to provide the data for both clinical trials, and then in section 6.2 we have to provide the data from the post-marketing perspective. So this is something exactly similar to PSUR that we have to provide. I'm sure many of you who are doing PSURs, you would have seen that GP module 7 clearly provides how that needs to be calculated. Now, the section 7 is basically line listings and summary tabulation, and it's very important that a safety database is used by any PV team, because this exercise cannot be done manually. Whenever there is a clinical trial, you would have a lot of SEs or SUSARs, and they all are captured in the safety database. So from the safety database itself, this data can be generated, and line listings is basically taken for the serious adverse reaction during the reporting period. And when it comes to the summary tabulation, it is always cumulative. So when I say cumulative, it means that the data has to be taken from the start of the date of the international birth date till the data log point. And when I talk about the line listings for this particular section, it has to be taken for the particular reporting period. So basically from the last DLP to the DLP which is applicable for this particular cycle that we are preparing for. And again, a very important thing that should be noted is that the line listings and tabulation should again include blinded and unblinded clinical trial data. And I would like to emphasize here a very important thing is that just for the purpose of DSUR, there is no requirement for doing any unblinding. Again, the design and structure of the trial remains the same. If there is a study for which we just have the SEs which are blinded, so of course we would just need to basically put that in the blinded form. But if say there is a study which has already been completed and we already have the unblind data, then we could always put the unblind data. Or say if we have some data wherein expedited reporting was done for SUSARs and we already have some unblind information, so that data can be still used for providing the unblind information. But otherwise, if there is a double blind study which is still ongoing, so the data still remains always blinded. Okay, so in this particular section, we have section 7.1 for which is for the reference information. So it's very important that we mention which particular MEDRA version of the coding dictionary has been used. We also need to specify the document and the version used as the reference safety information for determining the expectedness for the tabulations wherever required by the national or regional laws or regulations. Then in section 7, there is a section 7.2 wherein we have to specifically provide the line listings. As I mentioned, it is just basically taken from the database normally. And idea here is not to provide any kind of analysis or conclusion. It is just a specific data for the serious adverse reactions for the reporting period. And again, it's very important that there is a particular format that has to be followed. And Shruti will talk about these appendices in her presentation. And this data should basically have, say, the subject study identification number or the URCT number if it is applicable for if the trial is in Europe, the subject clinical trial identification number, the country in which the case occurred, the treatment group, if basically it was blinded and the blind has not been broken, so it just has to be mentioned as blind. Dosage and dosing interval of the investigation drug has to be mentioned. The exact serious adverse reaction with the MEDRA PD term has to be mentioned here, because whenever we do the MEDRA, there is the verbatim, and then we take the LLT and we get the preferred term. So it's important that we capture the preferred term here, and then we have to mention outcome, whether it was resolved or fatal or improved. So that has to be captured in the line listings. Then we have the summary tabulation, as I mentioned earlier. The summary tabulation has to be cumulative. So the data has to be there from the international birth date to the data log point. So everything has to be provided in this particular tabulation. And in case if the data is omitted due to some reason, so it has to be mentioned and the clarification should be given. Sometimes it may happen because, say, there is a product that gets marketed and maybe due to some reason you don't have the entire data, maybe because of some business merge. So in case any such practical challenge is there, so that rationale should always be given, because if due to some reason some data cannot be provided, it's not that we just can ignore that. We can at least make some justification in the document itself if some data is not provided. Then we also have to provide significant findings from the clinical trials during the reporting period. And the data can come from whether completed clinical trials or ongoing clinical trials. The data can come from any long-term follow-up, or there could be some other therapeutic uses of investigational product. There could be some data coming from the combination therapy. So all of these have to be provided in section 8. And if we focus on the completed clinical trials, this section should provide a brief summary of clinically important emerging efficacy and safety findings obtained from the clinical trials completed during the reporting period. And again, there is no particular tabulation or any kind of a fixed format. As per ICH G2F, it is clearly mentioned that this information can be provided in some kind of a narrative format or maybe a synopsis. And it could include information that supports or refutes previously identified safety issues, as well as evidence of any new safety signals. Then the data has to be provided for significant findings from the ongoing clinical trials. Now, when the trials are ongoing, especially if it's a double-blind data, so it's not necessary that you may have the safety information, but in case if there is an interim safety analysis that has been done, so that data can be provided. So it's not that you have to provide something necessarily. It's just that in case you have some safety signal coming out from a particular ongoing clinical trial, it has to be provided. Otherwise, we can always mention that, okay, there is no new signal that is there from this trial. Or in case, as I mentioned, if some interim analysis has been done and we get to know any particular safety concern, so that has to be mentioned. And again, I'm again emphasizing that whenever we are putting these findings from these ongoing or completed trials, we're just talking mainly from the safety perspective or from any new signal perspective. Then we can have data from any long-term follow-up, so that needs to be provided. And it's very important that whenever we talk about the long-term follow-up, first of all, that may or may not be applicable, because sometimes the regulatory authorities may particularly ask, and this is something we've seen in many trials, when the regulatory authorities may ask that a long-term follow-up study should be done just to see, because if they think that the drug might have a safety concern, or even as a sponsor, a proactive call sometimes is taken that long-term follow-up is required, say for some particular investigation product, especially like the products which are for advanced therapy products like gene therapy or cell therapy products or tissue engineered products. So in those kind of things, this is very important. And sometimes, in fact, what happens is that maybe the clinical trials are by and large over, but only the long-term follow-up studies are done. So when the DSUR is basically required during that particular reporting period, when there is just long-term follow-up, so maybe the significant finding would be only coming from the long-term follow-up, and the other section may not be even required, especially when we talk about section 8, which is significant finding from the clinical trials during the reporting period. Then we have also significant finding from the other uses of therapeutic use of the investigational drug, and this particular section of the DSUR, as per ICH E2F, should include clinically important safety information from other programs which are conducted by sponsors that follow a specific protocol with solicited reporting as per ICH E2D. Now, there could be various examples like compassionate use, or there could be examples like single patient IND or expanded access program. So wherever these kind of things are used, so we have to see if there is a safety information or signal coming out from these particular trials. Another important part is the safety data which is coming from the combination therapy. Now, if there is a combination therapy, say A plus B, and Dr. Mugdha also explained that earlier. So in case we are talking about the DSUR for a investigational drug, which is basically having a combination of A or B product, then it's important that if there is a clinical trial which is done for a standalone drug, so we need to basically provide at least some summary of safety concerns coming from the clinical trial, which is done just for one of the component of that particular combination product. And vice versa is also required to be done. So as per ICH E2F, if we are preparing, say, DSUR of a particular component, say component B or component A, then it's very important that when we prepare the safety section, especially in this particular section, we need to provide the safety concerns coming from the combination of A plus B. So it's not that there is a kind of a big line listing or summary tabulation that is required. It's just that the summary is required to be provided, especially for the safety concerns coming from the combination, if we are preparing the signaling or the safety concern for a single component. Okay, so again, I think I'll make it quick. These are some sections where the safety findings are required for non-interventional studies, which could be observational, epidemiology, or registries. Then if there is any other data which is required from some other clinical trials, so that can also be provided. Again, sometimes there could be investigator-initiated trials. So idea is to just see that if there is any safety concern coming from any of these trials, so they should be provided in this particular section. And of course, if there is a marketing data that also, again, which is having a new signal or new safety concern, so that should be provided. Similarly, if there is a safety signal coming from the non-clinical data, this needs to be provided again in section 12. There is a section on literature, and again, in the literature, the main thing is that we have to find the relevant safety findings. If there is a clinical data or non-clinical, at the end of the day, everything is relevant, or even the information from drugs of the same class. So everything is important and relevant, as long as there is a relevant safety concern coming from these particular literature articles. Similarly, if there are some other DSURs prepared, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes there could be different routes of administration. Ideally, within the single DSUR, the data can be provided, but in case there are some other DSURs which have been prepared in parallel, so any safety concerns coming from the other DSURs should also be mentioned in the particular DSUR. So idea is to put some cross-reference to the other DSURs in case they have been provided. Similarly, we also need to mention about the lack of efficacy. And again, a very important thing is that when we talk about lack of efficacy, it is related to established therapy. So let me take an example. Say if we are conducting a clinical trial of say ischemic heart disease, and say we are dealing with some anti-lipid therapy or antiplatelet therapy. Say routinely we don't expect that kind of modality, but say if we are expecting a lot of coronary artery disease patients with a particular investigation product, so it means that there is something which needs to be looked into. So otherwise, like the idea of lack of efficacy for the DSUR is to basically see for scenarios where there is a lack of efficacy either for life-threatening condition or maybe related to the established therapy. So normally, say we are not expecting that much mortality, but in a particular clinical trial, if we are having very high incidence of ischemic heart disease or mortality because of it, then obviously there could be safety concern, and that needs to be mentioned in detail in this section. Otherwise, generally we don't get safety concerns from lack of efficacy. Then there are some regional specific information, so I'll not go into the details. Idea is to just provide those specific regional information which are given as per ICH-2F, like list of subjects who died during the reporting period or who dropped out of the clinical trials, or sometimes there can be some phase 1 protocol modifications. There can be some manufacturing changes which can be done during the reporting period. So all of these things have to be done as per the regional specific information. Then, as I mentioned about these things, sometimes there could be a log of outstanding business with respect to US INDA. So that data also data also need to be provided in this particular section. And of course, if there is any particular late breaking information, late breaking doesn't mean that we are just kind of talking about essays. Unless there is a major signal that comes up during the reporting period, we are not concerned with that. Otherwise, or say if a preclinical study is ongoing, and if we get to know a major safety concern from that, that needs to be captured. Otherwise, this particular section should not be having any major information. So at the end, we have to mention about the overall safety information, which is to be concise. If there is a new signal that comes up, that needs to be mentioned in detail. And in case the benefit risk assessment remains the same, so we just have to mention that briefly. So this section has to be very concise and has to be very specific. Dr. Mugdha explained about identified and potential risks. So in case we get any new risk, which is already established now, so those things should be mentioned as identified risk. In case if there is any particular potential risk which we are kind of evaluating, so those things should be mentioned. So if there is no new risk which is identified, so we can always briefly mention that no new risk has been identified. So if the benefit risk profile changes, we have to mention that. And in case there is no new safety risk that changes the benefit risk profile, so we have to mention that briefly in this particular section, because at the end of the day, the basic objective is to ensure that the benefit risk profile remains intact. And this particular section should again just mention about the summary of the important risk, and if there are any changes to the risk, as I mentioned earlier, so they should be summarized here in this particular section. And finally, in the conclusion section of the DSUR, we have to make a brief statement whether there is any change in the risk, any change in the signals which were identified, and whether there is any kind of a benefit risk profile change for a particular product. I think I'll now move to the next session. I'll request Shruti Mehrotra to take on the last part of the presentation, which is the appendices. And before I hand over to Shruti, just give a brief introduction for her. She is an experienced professional with a demonstrated history of working in the research industry. She started her journey back in the year 2008, and since then she gradually rose up and worked for the renowned names of the industry, including Ranbaxy, Baxter, Shire, Takeda, NLM, and many more. She brings her expertise in databases like Argus Safety and RSG and other PV aspects like PV auditing, MEDRA, reporting rules, regulations across the globe. She's a strong quality assurance professional with Master of Science Clinical Research from Cranfield University. So over to Shruti Mehrotra.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Team AWINSA, for such knowledge share sessions, and Dr. Miglani for this warm introduction. So from my perception of what has been discussed till now, the main objective of DSUR is to present a comprehensive, thoughtful annual review and evaluation of pertinent safety information collected during the reporting period related to a drug under investigation. The DSUR should also be concise and provide information to assure regulators that sponsors are adequately monitoring and evaluating the evolving safety profile of the investigational drug. It serves as an annual report to the regulatory authorities. Now, coming up to the appendices, the current slide shows all the appendices in the DSUR, which we shall be touching base with them in depth. In the talk, we mentioned inclusion of RSI. So investigator brochure is the document which encloses the reference safety information of IND. And as Dr. Miglani mentioned, this should indicate version numbers and date. In situations if IB is revised during the reporting period, it must be included in the DSUR if not submitted prior. Again, picking up threads from Dr. Miglani's slides, which refer to action taken in the reporting period for safety reasons. The section in DSUR provides significant actions related to safety that have been taken during the reporting period, which can be those taken by the sponsors or regulators or data monitoring committees or ethics committees that had an impact on the conduct of clinical trials. So the section provides details of all the actions with reasonings exhibiting transparency. The appendix shall include a cumulative list of such requests from the regulatory authorities, including any update if applicable. Appendix 3 is status of ongoing and completed clinical trials. Before moving further, I would like to highlight the objective of DSUR, which is to present a comprehensive, thoughtful annual review, and the tabular representation caters it well. So it provides a very clear picture with relevant details. For the molecule as a whole, worldwide data of completed and ongoing clinical trial is submitted. We also have an example of column and heads for such tables, which may tend to cater the requirement. Appendix 4 comprises the cumulative number of subjects exposed to the investigational drug from ongoing and completed clinical trials, which are subgrouped by age, sex, and race. Appendix 5, it is the line listing of serious adverse reactions, includes unblinded data, maybe from the completed trials or those cases which have been unblinded for safety-related reasons, and blinded data as well. It is important to note that data should not be specially unblinded for the reason of submission of the DSUR. Another key aspect is that the data should be organized by trials and then by MEDRA SOC. Moreover, patient should be listed just once, and if a patient have experienced multiple events, then the case should be listed under most serious adverse reaction as judged by the sponsor. Appendix 6, it is the cumulative summary tabulation of serious adverse events, again organized by SOC for all the arms. And Appendix 7, it includes all the scientific literature articles or abstracts referenced in the DSUR. Now, the last one is regional appendices. They are to cater national or regional requirements. It may include either or all of these listed appendices mentioned on the screen, with the key inclusions highlighted for ease. So for cumulative summary tabulation of SARs, specifying the number of SARs by SOC, adverse reaction term, treatment arm, and unexpected reaction term. For the list of subjects who died during reporting period, they should have case numbers and assigned treatment, which can be blinded or unblinded, cause of death, and any safety issues identified from the review of death information should be addressed. For a list of subjects who dropped out of clinical trial during the reporting period, it should specify whether or not thought to be drug related, and any safety issues identified can be elaborated in the DSUR. In significant phase 1 protocol modifications, it should describe the protocol modifications made during the reporting period. Significant manufacturing changes may include a summary of significant manufacturing changes during the reporting period, description of general investigational plan, which may outline an investigational plan to replace that submitted for the previous year, and last one being a log of outstanding business with respect to US IND, for which the sponsor requests or expects a reply, or has any comments, or has any meeting requests for the regulatory authorities. So that ends my presentation, and at this point, I would thank you all for your participation and time. And herein I take this privilege to open the floor for questions.
Sure. I think in the interest of time, we'll take a couple of questions. We do have some questions from the audience, so let me just take the first question. I think the first question is, do we need to mention the action taken only for the clinical trials in section 3? So no, as I mentioned earlier, that the action taken should be applicable both for the clinical trials as well as the marketing. Of course, that is applicable only if the product is in the marketing phase also. Generally, sometime when we are involved in the clinical trials, the products are in the investigation phase. So obviously, the requirement is only to mention about the action taken for clinical trials only. So if there is any kind of a restriction on a particular population, or say if there is a risk management activity during the course of a trial which is implemented, if there is a protocol modification, so all of these things have to be mentioned. But yes, of course, if the product is already marketed and if there is any kind of a new restrictions or any kind of risk management activity that is taken, at the end of the day, if there is a safety concern, the active mode is same, whether the product is in the marketing also at the same time. So any kind of action taken from a safety perspective is applicable. So in this particular section, we have to mention both for the investigation phase as well as the post-marketing phase. Let me see. I think there is a question on how is the unblinding data managed for the DSUR. So I think what you're trying to ask is unblind data. First of all, let me clarify, as I mentioned earlier also, for the purpose of DSUR, there is no requirement to do any unblinding. The study design always remains the same. It's just that whatever data we have in form of any unblind data, so that can be provided. So when we are talking about say line listings or say summary tabulation, now there could be some ADRs which might be happening say in a particular population for whom we know the drug, or say we know the patient were say on placebo, say if it was an open label study, and we know that okay, we already have the clear distribution in terms of the treatment arms, so which is fine. Then we can always mention about those kind of ADRs occurring whether in treatment arm, in placebo or comparator. But yes, say today if you're dealing with a double blind study, and say the entire data, say all the assays that have been reported are obviously blinded and the study is still ongoing. So for practical purposes, everything will be just blinded, and we can't just do any unblinding for the purpose of DSUR. And similarly, when we talk about the cumulative exposure, if we know something already, which is already in the form of open label, or if there is a data from the previously conducted studies for which now unblinding has been done, then only we can provide the data. Otherwise, if data is blinded, so it will still remain blinded. For the purpose of DSUR, there is no unblinding that is required. I think there is another question for products which are in the investigational phase for some indication, but are approved for some indication. Is the PSUR sufficient? Maybe Mudha, you want to take on this question?
Yeah, sure, Sanjeev. Yeah, so I think the question is basically for the products which are in the investigational phase for some indications, but are approved for some indications. Is the PSUR sufficient if the data from the investigational trials is added in the PSUR itself? So yeah, so as I was discussing in the presentation that in case the product is in the investigational phase and the same product has also been approved for certain indications, so in that scenario, PSUR and DSUR both have to be prepared as a standalone documents as per the regulatory requirements. The only point will be that obviously the data from the PSUR, the relevant safety data from the PSUR, has to go into the DSUR, and the relevant data from the DSUR from clinical trials perspective has to be included in the post-marketing PSUR report as well. So in a way, some of the data will be overlapping, but yes, as per the requirements, both have to be prepared and both have to be submitted. I'll take another question. So it is, there is a question, do the ethics committees require complete DSURs? Yeah, so again, as per the guidelines, or as we also discussed during the webinar, that ethics committees generally require the executive summary, or just the concise summary of the entire DSUR data, which is there in the executive summary, presented in the executive summary, along with the title page. So that actually stands as a standalone document which can be submitted to the ethics committees, unless there is any specific procedure or processes at ethics committee or IRB's end. So they generally are fine with these, sponsors submitting the executive summaries only. I think with this, we would like to end the webinar today, and thank you so much everyone for taking out your time and attending the webinar. On behalf of AWINSA team, we thank you so much, and looking forward to having a webinar soon, and looking forward to have your attendance there as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye.